Baviaans Talk 2024, the Baviaans podcast show, if you want to call it a podcast show. We're in the EcoBound shed. I'm joined by Harold. Welcome, Harold.
Thanks, Zane. Good to be here.
You should know Harold by now. He's the guy from Polar. We are going to talk about climbing. Harold, climbing in the Baviaans, Baviaans Kloof, it's quite a significant part of the race. It sounds like, I think, if you look at the stats and you look at 230 Ks, almost 3,000 meters of climbing, you think you've got a lot of distance to get that climbing. It's not so significant. But the fact of the matter is that most of the climbs are in the later part of the race. And that's where it comes for. But before we go there, you just shared before we started recording that section before the roof. Tell us what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, as we've always said, this route profile is probably one of the most deceptive ones out there. You know, like sitting at a restaurant, ordering off the picture, off the menu, and then not getting what you expected. But yeah, the climbing starts almost from the gun out of Willamore, and it's not drastic climbing, but it all adds up. It adds up to the almost 3,000 meters of climbing in the event. And up to the roof is a constant drag upwards, and some of the climbs are significant. They're not steep, but they do tax the legs a bit, and you find out very quickly if you're possibly on a good or a bad day. So I think it's really underrated. Then at that stage, obviously enthusiasm is high, the motivation is high, and the pace is being pushed along, and that can come to haunt you at a later stage. So yeah, don't underestimate the climbing up to the roof. It's before you drop down into the valley. It does add to the fatigue that you're going to experience later.
Yeah, and I think to add to the excitement is high. It's typically where the big bunch riding is still happening, and you feel like you want to stick in that bunch. So you're pushing maybe a bit too hard to stay up those climbs, and it's understanding whether you're happy to burn those matches now, and will you recover later, or is it better to take it a bit easier?
I think a lot of that will come from what you've done in training, understanding your heart rate zones, you know, the intensity, the internal intensity, what is costing you to do the work. If that cost is too high initially, you are, as you put it, burning matches that you need later. So I think it's a really realistic decision within your team to say, guys, let's just tap off, let's not ride in this bunch. And obviously, if you're riding for the podium, it might be a different decision. But at the end of the day, I think it's easier to be more conservative initially. Check your heart rate, make sure it's not too high. You're not burning too many calories or too many matches initially, because you'll certainly need it later on.
Yeah. All right. So now rolling on, I think at about 103, 104 Ks. The first little climb, the indicator climb, the Cramp kicker. Tell us more what you think about that Cramp kicker. We had a competition for naming it, but it's now officially known as Cramp kicker.
I think it's a very appropriate name because it'll show you if you've been pushing too hard for the first 100 Ks. It comes as you enter the reserve. The roads now become a lot rougher, a lot more rocky before you hit that. So it's a real indicator of where you're at in the event. And that said, obviously, if you do suffer up there a bit, you've got lots of time to fix it. You've got time to back off, recover a bit, make sure you're taking in enough nutrition. But it is a good indicator of whether you've possibly pushed a little bit too hard on the flatter downhill sections, in inverted commas. So the Cramp kicker is really the first one that'll give you a good indication of where you're at.
Yeah. Then we roll on to the Baviaans Back. Now, I've many times in the car, traveling through the race, helping and checking the riders, heard riders communicate to one another on that climb, is this the Mac? And it's quite easily mistaken for the Mac, but it's quite a long climb. It's the first proper climb of the race. I think we've explained the other climbs that they are there, but it's the first pass.
Yeah.
Let's call it's the first pass that you climb. It's a beautiful climb. It's really beautiful once you go over the top, and where the Baviaans Back name comes from is that section at the top where you're actually just going along the side of the mountain, and that's really for me one of the special places of the Baviaans Kloof, traveling through there.
Yeah, and depending on the time of day you hit that climb, is that heat can sit in the valley there leading up to it, so you can feel like you're getting really hot, and making sure, obviously you want to make sure you hydrate well, keep on hydrating, but that's where the heat part of the race for me has always come in a bit before Baviaans Back.
Yeah.
And it's deceptive because you sort of reach the crest of it and then you're still rolling a little bit uphill towards the final top. But it is a very scenic area, and I encourage riders to take some time, have a look at what you're riding through, not just to race through there. But most of us will take a good breather when we hit the first little top section.
So before we go into the fangs and the Mac, in preparation and planning and training for climbing. So a lot of our riders come from the upper country. We've obviously got a lot of Western Cape riders as well, and all over the country and all over the world for that matter. But a lot of people don't have access to really good mountain passes to train for. And what's your advice in preparing to be able to be ready for climbing and Trans-Baviaans?
It's a difficult one because you want to try and somehow simulate what you're in for. And we obviously don't have, in a lot of parts of the country, the length of the climbs that you'll have or experience in the event. So the only real recommendation would be to do something like hill repeats. Find a climb, a decent climb. In Johannesburg, we have a number of them where you can go up for a kilometer or maybe a little bit longer, climb 100, 150 meters, and just keep on repeating that, because a lot of the climbing is about rhythm, but you also want to accumulate meters and ascent in your training sessions. And the general recommendation is anywhere between 200 to 250 an hour. So if you've decided your long slow distance ride will also be a climbing session, you'll incorporate some climbing over a 4-hour long slow distance ride, you want to try and accumulate close to 1,000 meters of ascent. Yeah. So you can simulate that. There are obviously certain areas of the country where that might be quite difficult to do because it's really flat. But I think somewhere you'll find something that you can simulate. And hill repeats are generally quite good to do that, because if you've got a steady climb, you can set a certain heart rate zone that you want to be in to make sure that you can sustain that effort for the climb. And then once, obviously, you come back down and do it. And we have one that we use up in Johannesburg. It's just over a kilometer long, 100 meters in ascent. And by the time we get closer to the event, we want to have done anywhere between 10 to 15 repeats up there. So that gives you a fair amount of climbing and also finding your rhythm. And a lot of it is the mental game of climbing as well, understanding that you can actually achieve this, but you need to simulate it somehow in training.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also the position of how you sit on the bike on a climb compared to just normal riding. And that's also all about the indoor training sessions. It builds stamina, but it's not the real thing, especially when it comes to climbing.
Yeah, and I think, look, indoor training has its value on the indoor trainer. You can simulate possibly the effort of a climb, but I think there's a lot of a mental component that I can actually do this. And I just encourage you to incorporate it in your training. All the devices we have these days on our bikes, the bike computers will give you some measure of ascent. Normally it's barometric measurement of meters climbed, because that's the accurate one. And yeah, try and accumulate those meters per hour. You can use something like VAM is a measurement that you find on products where you can see what your rate of climbing is, meters per hour. So you can correlate that back to your heart rate, your internal intensity, and see what your climbing speed is like if you're interested in that part. But I think it's more important just to try and get those meters in, the meters climbed. As I said, 200 to 250 an hour is generally a good recommendation. If you're staying, unfortunately, in the flatlands of this country, you might have a few challenges. You might need to go and find some climb that you can repeat a number of times. Yeah. But it is generally a good idea to incorporate that for an event like the Trans.
All right, the fangs. I don't think there's much we can say. They're steep as hell and technical, and at least there's a bit of a nice respite on the other side down of each of them. But they really take it out of you climbing them.
I think the fangs, both of them, are probably the harder climbs in the event because they are extremely steep. Seen lots of grown-ups cry on those climbs, but they're not insurmountable. And let's say there's no harm in walking them.
Yeah.
There's no one will disrespect you in any way or think anything less of you. If you're not up for it, just walk them because you've got a long way to go still. You haven't even got to the 140k mark on Bergplaats.
Exactly.
So if you don't feel up for it and they just seem overwhelming, just walk them. I think a lot of people in the race end up walking the fangs because they are steep. They are bricked,
Yeah.
so that makes it possibly the road surface a little more rideable, but they are still extremely steep. So don't be intimidated. You'll get over them. They are fairly short. I think in the region of just over a kilometer for the first one and maybe 800 meters for the second one.
Correct, yes.
So they are fairly short. You walk up, it just takes you a little bit extra time and you probably won't break your body down for the rest of the race.
Right, and then rolling on to the MAC. But before we go into the MAC, and the MAC stands for Mother of All Climbs, there's these little undulating little starters, hors d'oeuvres, before you get to the main course. Those, my experience from riding last year is they actually quite tiresome before you actually start the MAC. And you think, okay, this must be the MAC, but then it's not. So then you go down again and then you start. Those are also something that we never talk about, and it's important to understand there's a few little climbs before you get to MAC.
Yeah, I think be prepared for those. There are these little steep and they're normally washed out to a certain extent depending on the rain for the year. They are steep and you can get over them. They are rideable, but they can be quite demoralizing, especially if you know you're not on the MAC yet. And the best way to encourage your teammate is to just be very vague whether they're part of the MAC or not. Yeah, just say, I think we might be on the MAC. But they are there and they are not part of the actual MAC climb, but they can tax you. So as long as you're prepared for them and you're expecting them to come, I think you manage quite okay over them.
Right, then the MAC. It's a long climb, probably about 10 kilometers. It's got some steeper sections than others, but it's a rideable climb. It's just a long mountain pass to get out of the Baviaans Cliff. And I think it tips from your side, Harold, like what is the thing once we see many riders walk up there. Once again, it's not a shame to walk up. What is your tips in terms of a team dynamic, riding, walking, or just doing the MAC?
I think the first thing to say about the MAC is that what makes it challenging is the concrete strips, because you want to try and ride on them and you want to try and stay on them. So that aspect takes quite a bit of energy and focus into the race now. And to ride on them is quite difficult. So it's, again, not something that you cannot do, but you are tired, you're fatigued.
Yeah, the focus takes a bit more.
Yeah, so it takes a bit of concentration to ride on them. The other aspect is obviously consider your team dynamics. If you have riders that at this stage might be battling, maybe just hop off and walk with them, because you're going to get up you're going to wait anyway. You might be cooling down. If it's at night, you might be getting a bit cold, but it might just be good for team morale to all stick together and encourage each other, because accept that someone in your team might not just be as strong as you at that time and might be suffering up there. Talk to each other, say, look, I'm not feeling good, I'm going to take it really slow up there. And as you say, no disrespect in walking up there. What I have noticed is when people do walk up there is that they tend to be pushing their bike over the roughest section of the climb, which is not on the concrete strips. So my recommendation is put your bike onto the strips, push it on the strips. It's far easier walking over the rougher terrain than trying to get your bike over the rougher terrain. And then the other thing about the MAC, there are corners where you can then take a rest break, get slightly off route. You can just stand in one of the corners, recover before you tackle the next section. So as they say, the classic saying goes, the way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. And that's the way you should tackle the Mac. But understand that it does take a bit of skill to stay on the strip, and the strip does disappear every now and then, so you have to go through the dip and get back onto it. And that's probably what makes the climb quite hard for some of us to get up there and ride the whole way up.
And then the mental part that also comes into play with the Mac is when you think you've crested the top, the false summit of the Mac. It's a well-known thing, the false summit. It's right there. There's a little bit of a tourism information center and toilets there at the top, and then you've got this long drag. It's not steep at all, but there's a drag to Bergplaats.
It's not steep, but the road surface can be a bit dodgy. It can be a bit washed out, so you again have to concentrate where you're riding. But again, it's the mental aspect. You think, I've got to the top of Mac, and now I still have to do 5 odd kilometers, I think it is, up to the checkpoint. So the checkpoint is not directly at the summit of the Mac. You've still got to ride up to Bergplaats, and that 5 kilometers can be quite taxing.
Yeah.
Again, mentally, because you're possibly not prepared for it. So that's why we're talking about it now, to say, look, once you've crested there, maybe take a breather, have a drink, have some nutrition, and then be prepared for another 5 kilometers before you get to the checkpoint.
Yeah, exactly. Then we roll on, I'll touch, it's not climbing, but the Big Dipper, one of the most glorious downhills in the race. And then after checkpoint 5, the Never Ender. The name says it all, Never Ender. I don't know what the advice is there. Even I last year, also, you run out of energy and morale when you're on that climb. It's in the dark, you can't see the summit. And it's probably the climb in the world with the most false summits that exists.
Yeah, I think as long as you're prepared that it's in the region of 12 or 13 kilometers, if I remember correctly,
yeah.
so that you are going to be there for a fair amount of time. One of the things that I think a lot of riders are considering is when they ride, there's that first little climb that you go over, which is not the Never Ender, where I think there's a game fence on the left-hand side.
Yes.
So that climb is not part of the Never Ender. Only once you dip down and start climbing again after the game fence, then you're starting the Never Ender. So don't calculate your 13 Ks from where you've just come next to the game fence. It's a lot further than that. So understanding again where you are en route is a good idea. And the Never Ender, very appropriate name. As you say, the best false summits in the world. And it takes time, and be patient, ride your pace, ride your teammates' pace if necessary, and stick together, because it is the hard part of the race. You've now done probably 180 odd kilometers close to, and now you want to get to checkpoint, the last checkpoint at the Jaffels. And it does take time. It's not gonna be a quick 20 kilometers to get there.
The last little climb of the race, we won't talk about the railway line. It's got a bit of a angle, but Mini Mac. So also that was riders gave the name because of where it is in the race. It's after 200 Ks, a little climb. I've personally broken a chain on that climb before, but it's just a short, steep climb.
I like your words, just short. I think it's almost a kilometer long.
Yeah.
And it has been graded recently.
It was in really good condition
so
last year.
It was really good condition last year, but it has also been really rocky, but it is rideable if your legs are still up for it. And generally you hit that in the dark as well. So it's also got a bit of a false flat at the top. As soon as you turn the corner, it keeps on rolling up a bit. You have reached the top of Mini Mac, but you're still rolling towards the wind turbines and the gate.
Correct.
So there is still a bit of work to be done till you start dropping down to the railway line.
I think that covers all the significant climbs of the race, and there's many little other humps that you have to go over in Baviaans. But in the end, climbing, there's only one way. It's getting out there and
part
preparing.
of the race, and it should be part of your training. Find a good rhythm, find comfort, be able to climb comfortably, and accept that you mentally need to be able to focus on these climbs, and that it is part of your training. It's really just a mental game when it comes to climbing. And also, don't overextend yourself in the early climbs, as we've discussed with the roof. Don't get too enthusiastic. Hang back, because from, I would say, from checkpoint 5, 180 Ks, you're still going to climb significant amounts.
Exactly. All right, guys, that's the climbing episode of the Trans Talk podcast for 2024. I hope that was some insight in the climbs of the race. Harold, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Zane.
Send us that memorabilia, those images, stories, and hit the like and subscribe button. Cheers, guys.